people are coming in. Just to give you an idea, sir, we already had 22 lectures successful in the Gnosis team, almost right from the time of his inception. So it's an absolute honor and pleasure to have you, sir. The platform is all yours, sir.
Right. Thank you, Shrikant, and a very good afternoon to all of you. As Shrikant has pointed out, I have been associated with Gnosis for quite some time as it moves on with its sort of quest for knowledge. And I'd like to commend Shrikant for, holding such a long series of lectures. He's creating a digital repertoire, as it were, of interesting discussions, which will, I'm sure, in the coming years, prove invaluable to many researchers. You see, the lockdown has given us some time to reflect and go back to our academic activities in a more, I would say, in a more condensed way, so that some new researchers are coming out. And I think, for me, it's been somebody who's been saturated with a lot of responsibilities. It's been some kind of a hiatus where I have gone back to my original love, as it were, when I started off my career, the 18th century. And one of the magical figures of the 18th century, Daniel Defoe. At the same time, when I was taking a look at the pandemic around, I also went back to history and tried to find out how such pandemics have charted out their courses in literature and the visual arts. So this research actually generated from a close study of the text in one of my courses, in a text that's not so very well known, but in Defoe studies, it's been a fascinating, aporia, as it were, where, the boundaries of fiction have, as it were, being tested. So I taught this text in one particular class, and since then it has continued to incite my interest, and the pandemic just added fuel to the fire, as it were. And here I am with some new insights into what was already a continuing research. I've titled it Such as No Tongue Can Express: Trauma and Post-Memory in Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. It's published 1722. Now, many of you will have noticed when we were discussing epidemics in literature, how very little representation we actually have of the greatest epidemic that ever occurred in human history, the plague. And this was one of the points which led me to think about why was there such a paucity. And if the paucity was there in texts which actually brought out the discussions on the plague, what were the directions in which representation moved? The plague was, of course, traumatic. And this is not a trauma that lasted, say, 2 months or a year or 20 years. It was a sustained period of trauma, generation after generation, succumbing to it without, as it were, any kind of relief in sight. So what exactly was the nature of the trauma? And the second question that obviously many of you who dabble with trauma studies will realize, how is it embedded in memory and what I will call here, vis-a-vis Marianne Hirsch, post-memory? So how have generations actually embedded their plague narratives and relived them? And I'll also ask somewhere whether these memories have spilled over into phases where the plague actually vanished. And that is, I'm saying, after the 18th century. So without further ado, let me move on to my next slide, as it were. As I said, the Black Death or the plague was probably the truest pandemic that the world ever had encountered. It swept, apart from Iceland, it swept almost every other zone of the world. Nearly third of the global population was affected and perished. It had a very high mortality rate, as I pointed out in another lecture, almost 30%. So 1 out of every 3 people died. It was extremely painful and traumatic. So the physical trauma of plague was immensely frightening. I will discuss this subsequently. It was a devastatingly quick death. So you actually developed the plague one night and could be dead within 3 hours. And as I said, 1300, the plague breaks out more or less in Europe, continues till 1600, 1700, 1720, it still continues in many areas. And it was not merely a Middle Age phenomenon, it was also something which took place in the classical times as well. So spread across several centuries and several outbreaks. Now, any good discussion has to focus on certain research questions. So I will keep the Great Plague as a gateway and ask how the theoretical approaches can be applied to the journal of the plague year in conjunction with a few visual representations of the plague. This is something which I'm adding on to a discussion. Whatever visual representations of the plague I've actually located, I've tried to theorize on that. And the prism of theory that I'm going to use here is the theory of trauma, memory, post-memory, and the politics of marginality. So these are my theoretical prisms. That is my gateway. And I'm going to ask what kinds of trauma, who underwent these traumas, and how did they respond to these traumas. Now, I'll start off not with a theorist who actually worked with trauma, but somebody who's dealt with politics and the politics of representation, Foucault. And Foucault talks about, in Discipline and Punish, of course, he talks about 2 dreams of the plague. He talks about the political dream of the plague, which imagines the measures taken against the spreading of the contagion and tries to contain it, right? And Foucault, of course, sees this as the first great modern moment when the plague is, when society moves towards a containment. You know, it's for Foucault that one space, that one moment when the ideal method of containment of the state is sort of theorized. But Foucault also talks, and this is something which we have not discussed adequately, about the literary dream, which celebrates in the plague, Foucault says, the dissolution of all order, and specifically the dissolution of the confines of individuality. And Foucault talks about the literature of the plague, where there's a decomposition of individuality, a kind of a dream in which plague is the moment when individuals come apart and when the law is forgotten. So a trauma which produces a kind of a collapse of the individuality, and therefore how does the literature represent it, is the question that I'm going to later ask. Well, let me take you back to the original theorist on trauma, on Freud. Studies in Hysteria, 1895. Freud talks about not merely the occurrence of the trauma, but the remembrance of the trauma. And that has been one of the directions, one of the major directions, I would say, in which trauma theory has been seen till the end of the century, from where it took on a different turn, bringing in other multiple theories within its ambit. But I'll go back to that original theory. And Freud talks about the latency period of deferred action that delays and affects the meaning of the past. And Freud talks about the chain of intermediate causal links and a directly releasing cause, just as psychical pain that is remembered in the waking consciousness still provokes a lacrimal secretion long after the event. So it's not merely the trauma that causes the psychic suffering, it is the attempt to relive it over and over again and to try and come to terms with it. And this is where, you know, modern studies have moved into post-traumatic stress disorder. and taken on a new turn altogether. The other operative theorist, many of you are aware, in fact, anybody who's worked on trauma theory is aware, I'm not making any new ground here, is Cathy Caruth, where trauma is seen as the unassimilated event that shatters identity. So there's a dissociation of identity somewhere and remains outside normal memory and narrative representation. So trauma, Caruth says, is viewed as an event that fragments consciousness and prevents direct linguistic representation. Right, so in a certain way, Caruth is suggesting that there is no narrative representation, complete narrative representation of trauma possible in a certain way. But there is always this attempt to represent, and there is always this shadow that falls between the representation and the event, the memory and the representation. So trauma is, as it were, also in Caruth, associated with a certain degree of incompleteness. And these incompletenesses, these blank zones, are the areas, the unspokenness of the traumas are areas in which the narrative actually gains its intensity. But I'm not going to merely talk about individual trauma. I'm going to talk about social trauma as well, collective trauma, as it were, because plague was both individual and collective. You know, you suffered from the plague as an individual, if you lived, and you also suffered as a collective through memory, through seeing other victims of trauma. And therefore, social trauma, as has been theorized, is a period of severe attenuation and erosion, as well as from a sudden flash of fear. And trauma describes this overwhelming experience of sudden or catastrophic events. When a community is profoundly affected, one can speak of a damaged social organism. Please note that phrase, because that is going to be my, operative word in a certain way, because I'm going to see the plague as this recurrent monster who seems to stalk Europe over the centuries. So, if society is a mechanism and a body, then you have an oppositional, overpowering body of the plague that continuously traumatizes it. And therefore, traumatic experiences, Caruth says, work their way so thoroughly into the grain of the affected community that they come to supply its prevailing mood and temper. So one of the major aspects of this, fatality of the Middle Age is probably caused by this, dance of death that the plague created, dominating its imagery. So plague, pestilence, contagion, and its sense of self, and govern the way in which members relate to one another. And somewhere, once again, you see, we are talking about some of the most important phases of European history, where the Middle Ages are sort of disappearing into the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is then, moving into the, deepening into the early modern development of the Enlightenment. So somewhere, the plague is also assimilated into this process of the shift of the history of ideas. And this is something which is fascinating, isn't it? The history of the plague superimposed upon the history of the ideas. And that is somewhere, that is the point which I'm trying to probe in certain ways in this discussion. Now, I'll also use this, and since I'm moving into psychoanalysis a little bit, I'll also talk about the crypt as a site, because you see, the plague was also marked by this sense of the pit. This, you see, plague created so many victims that you did not have adequate coffins. So you just thrust bodies into a crypt, one after the other. So where that pit became a site where human bodies actually sort of condensed into one another. It was this one gigantic human body, marked by stench, marked by disease, marked by death, and marked by fear. And you see how this concept of the pit, and I've given you one of the quotations there from, one of the medieval treatises on the plague, but the crypt becomes a site where experience is buried, an intrapsychic tomb, as it were. And this is where the site of the trauma, this tomb from where the memory seeks to forever escape and thereby generate more trauma. And the reactions may vary from despair, shock, hilarity, carnivalesque expression, repeated replaying of upsetting memories. And we will see in Defoe how all these reactions sort of bring in the traumatic reality into the foreground. Now, there is, however, one thing which I might and must also talk about is the sheer physical trauma. You see, we have to look at the plague not merely as something that generated immense trauma in the mind, but you see, the buboes, you had these swellings which were tremendously painful, which grew and then burst. And one of the attempts of the physicians of the period, and you can see them on the bodies of these sufferers, was to try and make these buboes explode. So you actually had, pricks on these buboes. You had oil being poured on them. You had warm, hot onions pressed on these buboes. So, it was suffering upon suffering. And very often you would be so aghast with this suffering, and they would break out all over your bodies, especially your groin, that you would run around into the streets, thereby generating your own trauma and creating a hideous sight. You have to just imagine these men and women shrieking all around the streets of London, and thereby traumatizing the entire social body, as it were. Of course, this is something which I came across very recently. Death, Lord have mercy upon us. The next slide, of course, is something which many of you have seen. This is the dance of death, right? Lord have mercy on London. We die, we die. I follow, we die. So you see, pervasive death. But what is interesting, apart from this, this depiction of the plague as that monstrous skeletal body which is traumatizing the city, is this slide. Because this is something which shows the classless structure of the plague. And plague is here shown as this monarch which spares nobody, and is this antichrist, as it were, the anti-god, as it were, if you could say, which is ruling the citizens with its enormous might. Right, so this is a very interesting sight. So plague creates a society which is an anti-society, as it were, a world upside down, but not in a comic sense, but in a horrible, traumatized state. Now, this is one of the first paintings that describes the plague. And you see, it's interesting. I was sort of carrying out my research on the depictions of the plague, and there was this belief in the Middle Age, which sort of persisted in the Renaissance as well, that if you talked about the plague, or if you wrote about the plague, you described the plague, painted the plague, you would actually catch the plague. You see, therefore, we are looking at a traumatized imagination, where the plague can, as it were, spread by contagion, spread by the contagion of the imagination. Now, why? Because you had no idea how the plague spread. Some said it spread by the air. Some said God provided it to us for our sins. So it could, as it were, spread through the imagination. And this is one of the first representations of the plague. This is a Belgian town where the people are, as it were, putting their death, the people in the coffins, and they're bringing this coffin, and you could take a look at the pain and suffering that are etched on their faces, and the sheer number of the dead. And you can see the pit once again, that horrible image of the pit, where these coffins were, as it were, be thrown one after the other. You see, this is another trauma, the ignominy of the lack of burial. Now, when we look at the COVID situation, one of the major traumas that we face is not merely the fear of dying, but also this fear that our bodies will be, put in body bags and then dumped into sites where, we will have no decent burial. You see, burial is one of the burial or the cremation is one of the more, modes in which, if you think, it provides a sense of closure. So plague, as it were, is a disease which gives you no closure, as it were. Therefore, in doomsday, you are just one body, one haunted body, which rises to meet the judgment. It's interesting in the way this depiction creates that element of the pit. Now, this is, and I am bringing to you images which are leading up to my, or are following from this sense of trauma. And this is something which is very interesting. This is the, this is a small spelling error there. It's Bruegel is with a G-E, A-E-U-E-G-E-L, I'm sorry for that typo. This is a 1562 painting of The Triumph of Death by Pieter Bruegel the Elder. If you take a look at this painting very carefully, and this is something which is worth taking a look at. If you take a look at this side of the painting, if you can see my cursor, you can see Death riding a chariot, as it were, where it's filled with skulls. And you can see this, this wheel actually crushing another man to death. So, and this is saturated by death. You can see the skeletons fighting the human beings here. And every single human being who is living under the shadow of death. If you see, here is the pit, actually, where it is saturated by a number of skulls. Presumably, this chariot will then go and put these skulls there. And you can see the coastline also, which is desolate, burnt, and you can see almost a great fire which has been set. So the plague is the Dantesque inferno. The plague is the trauma from where there is no escape, as Bruegel paints it in his 1562 version. You see, this was the Middle Ages, so we are actually moving forward. Now, this is probably one of the most important descriptions of the plague. This is the plague at Ashdod, Poussin. And Poussin's painting, as it were, gives us certain clues. Now, you will remember that this is taken from Samuel. This is a biblical plague for the displacement of the Ark of the Covenant, for stealing the Ark of the Covenant, rather. And there is this biblical plague on the city of Ashdod. Why does Poussin bring this into 1628? And because this is when the plague broke out at Naples. But it's interesting because from the biblical scenario, you are actually moving to the foreground where you actually have a woman. And this is the woman, if you can see my cursor here. And here is a man who's sort of taking out, is sort of snatching this baby from, who's trying to suckle over the mother's breast. And here lies another baby in the foreground who's obviously dead. And there's another child in the background who's also walking with Buboes, therefore who's another victim of the plague. And you could see these figures who are holding their noses with the stench of the plague overpowering them. So Poussin's plague is this cross between the biblical scenario as well as the modern depiction of the plague with all its physical excretions and its stenches, its smells. But very importantly, what Poussin is also doing, and this is where I bring something new to you, is how in the foreground, the traumatized body of the woman and the child is brought about. So you see, Poussin is looking not merely at the men who are involved in the plague, who are catastrophically sort of destroyed by the plague, but also the plague as traumatizing the female motherly body and the child. Again, where you see this is one of the other impacts of the plague which we forget. Thousands and thousands of infants were killed along with women. Maybe sometime later on, I'll talk about the impact of the plague on women and children in some other discussion. But let me quite quickly move on to another sort of depiction of the plague doctor. The plague doctor here named von Rom by Paulus Furst. This is 1656. You remember the earlier one was 1628. And those of you who are now looking at the PPEs, please remember that the plague also generated its own form of the PPE as early as the 17th century. This was the uniform. So you actually had a dress which covered you from head to toe, and you had a cap and a beak. And in this beak, you would actually have certain dried flowers or incense so that the smell could ward off the plague. They believed that the plague could be warded off by the smell. And you had, two holes here where the eyes and the noses would appear. But just imagine this: the appearance of the very plague doctor was in itself extremely traumatic. The doctor actually had nothing to do. You did not survive by medicine during the plague. So the appearance of the doctor meant you were to be taken to the other land. And therefore, the fear that this entire, dress, and, even if we look at it today, it would generate some kind of trauma within us. So, you see, medicine was failing before the plague. You actually had no clue. And therefore, even the appearance of the doctor had this impact on its audience. Now, 1662, remember, the Royal Society is going to come into being, and there's going to be this great leap in science. And therefore, thereafter, the images of the plague would change to a certain degree. Now, it is with these images, once again, let me get through back at you, because we've started off with the Middle Ages, come to 1562, 1628, 1656, that I come to Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. And this is 1722. As Defoe wrote, remember that Defoe actually, he was this writer who actually wrote most of his works anonymously. Even Robinson Crusoe was not written by, acknowledged by Defoe when it was published. So it's written by a citizen who continued all the while in London. So Defoe is claiming this to be a true history. This is a history, a journal of the plague year. The plague year was, of course, 1665. So I've provided you a timeline. Please remember this, because when we talk about memory and post-memory, these dates, 1665 and 1722, will become very important for us. So 1665, the plague breaks out in England. This is the last great outbreak of the plague in England. The total death is 65,717 at a conservative estimate. So almost a third of London is wiped out. A third of London escapes also, because when the plague broke out, people just drove away from the city. The mortality rate, as I pointed out, is almost 30%. So 1 out of every 3 persons died. January 1666, the plague actually died out during winter because the fleas which survived or which bred the plague died during winter. 1720, a deadly plague once again breaks out in Marseille. The English ports are closed, and then comes the spurt in plague literature, of which Defoe is probably the last contributor, because in 1722, when he writes the Journal of the Plague Year, the plague is almost dying out in Marseille. So Defoe is recreating a 1665 event in 1722. And that is where my concept of post-memory and memory will come in. Now, in other discussions, I've not talked about the other great trauma that London faced. In 1666, September, 3 days, the Great Fire broke out. And you could say a half of London was destroyed. Ironically, there have been suggestions that the fire actually destroyed the plague by killing all the rats. But that is very tenuous, but you had, therefore, trauma upon trauma. You had the plague, which was already a version of hell, followed by the fire. So it was the inferno in actual history. Now, just as, we are looking at 2020 as this year where everything is coming together, the cyclone and the pandemic, 1666, the people of London would have actually felt like us. Now, I have catalogued here contemporary plague literature. So Defoe was, my point being that Defoe was not the only one to write about it, of which I will look at this treatise by Nathaniel Hodge, which was called Loimologia. And this is the title page of that text. And you see, it's very interesting how the frontispiece is designed. And you can see that, rather than, looking at the plague and its sufferings or the trauma that is being caused, you are actually looking at two surgeons who are dissecting a body of the plague victim. So this is one of the moments, I think, where, secularism takes over the discussion of what was earlier considered to be a divine pestilence. And from henceforth, the depictions of the plague also in literature and art will take on a distinctly secular turn. Now, the features of the contemporary plague literature, talked about this earlier also, but there's this plague literature thrives on trauma. It is sensational in certain ways, and therefore Gaulish accounts of improbable details, people eating leather, soldiers being murdered, and Defoe himself talks about the pleasure of writing dismal stories. There were circulations of possible reasons and remedies, manuals of behavior, what to do during the plague and what not, superstitions and predictions, reactions to government strategies of containment, and of course, in the Puritan autobiographies, the divine pattern of retribution for contemporary corruption. So these were broadly the structure within which the plague literature operated. One of the important parts of these plague literatures was, of course, the bills of mortality. So you actually recorded who died where. And thanks to these bills of mortality, we actually have, week by week, almost just as we count corona day by day, week by week records of deaths. And you can see here in this particular week, 7,165 people dying out of the plague. Now, I'll quickly take you through one of the few, once again, artistic prints on the plague by a man called John Dunstall, who was, and this is important because he's creating this prints as the plague is bursting out. Dunstall probably did this in January 1666. So this is a visual history of the plague as it broke out. So in the first, you can see a series of prints, actually, 9 prints, of which in the first, you can see the nurses going to the houses of the plague victims. You have the digging of the pit once again. You have the coffins being carried to the pit. And very often, you had cartloads of bodies. You didn't have coffins. And this is an interesting one, the 8th of that print, where Dunstall is actually painting the people taking out a funeral procession. Now, funeral processions were banned at this point of time because they could create and generate more plague. But the people refused. And at one point of time, they broke through all social rules. So it's that moment of trauma also where, fear subsides and you actually break through the trauma into trying and reaching a certain sense of closure of suffering. That painting, that print therefore becomes a very important one. This is, of course, the end of trauma when people are returning to London after the plague has ended. Now, my point about Defoe's originality remains in the startling introduction of a narrative persona. So it's a journal, and at the same time, Defoe is presenting a fictional character, HF, Henry Foe. Who was this HF? HF was probably his own uncle, a saddler who remained in London, whilst Defoe, who was only 5 years old at that point of time, was taken to the country by his father. So where did Defoe actually learn about the plague? He learned about it from contemporary records. He learned about it also from the memories of his own uncle. Therefore, this is where, generations pass memories through for the next generation to write about. And this is where I'll take a small entry into post-memory in my next slides. And this HF is a very strange character who is both a third-person narrator as well as a first-person narrator, but he's extremely unempathetic, as if I might add it that way, playing on understatements. And there are certain choices that he makes, whether to stay or leave the city, marked by curiosity of death, and then finally the intense epiphany of survival, which I'll bring out in a moment. But very importantly, where this treatise becomes important is not the description of the plague, but the tendency towards extended meditation on the nature of the action. So you are actually having a first-person account as well as reflections on that first-person account. And that is what makes this text so very interesting in terms of trauma studies, because when the trauma has subsided, after a certain moment, the narrator is reflecting on how this memory is impacting him. So it is, as it were, the trauma is being experienced and being relived at the same time. And remember, this is a 1665 trauma, which is being relived in 1722. And that is where you see memory, post-memory becomes very interestingly intertwined in Defoe. So what are these moments of trauma? Now, I've talked very generally about them. But the first trauma that Defoe talks about is the trauma of departure. You see, people who were wealthy, people who could retire into the countries, the entire court, the court actually moved to Oxford at this point of time, were departing London. And this itself was the first trauma. Looking at people moving out and you being segregated and looking at death. And this, Defoe says, and that is where I would ask you to look at the texture of language here. See, when I've talked about Caruth, I've talked about this certain undescribability of trauma, the failure of language. You see, if you look at that first paragraph, that is very empirical, very descriptive, very exact. And you've talked about Whitechapel, you've talked about Broad Street, servants, women, coaches. And then when you're reflecting on this, suddenly language seems to fail. You talk in terms of superlatives, as it were. Very terrible and melancholy thing to see. So you see how the empirical suddenly collapses into a language which is very vague, as it were. And I could not but look on from morning to night. It filled me with very serious thoughts of the misery that was coming upon the city. Now, what the extent of this misery was, what was the sadness like, that HF does not describe. So once again, going back to Caruth's idea that, it's this indescribability of trauma that, where narrative becomes so very intriguing. And then comes this description of the collective trauma that I'm talking about, not individual. HF's trauma is not one trauma, is also the narrative everyman for the entire city of London. And Defoe writes, the face of London was now indeed strangely altered. And then Westminster, Southwark, sorrow and sadness sat upon every face. All looked deeply concerned. Everyone looked on himself and his country in the utmost danger. See, this is where there's a traumatic othering. So you see, when you are intent upon your own survival, and that is what Defoe, where Foucault is talking about, it's that moment when, and Agamben has talked about it also, that survival becomes the only instinct, that all the other bonds that make up your selfhood actually collapse. And this is where I go back to that Freudian concept of when the self is being, as it were, mangled, all your other forces are falling away, the other constituents of yourself, and the only basic instinct remains me, my survival, my family. And that is where, once again, you see social distancing as a phenomenon leads to a moment, the plague leads to that traumatized moment when you're that naked human being on earth who is strangely living in society, undergoing that trauma, but also entirely on his own, right? And you actually have the plague described in terms of the monster, the other, the city of London being the one body and the live plague being the other monster. And just remember this metaphor of the monster, because in another depiction, I'm going to talk about this plague as a monster. You see how death is personified in Defoe, looks into their faces, visits them, haunts them, rides on a pale horse. See how the biblical mythology sort of becomes an operative way into which plague sort of slowly grows throughout the novel and seems to strangulate the text, creating trauma after trauma. It's a cumulative trauma that Defoe is talking about, and where the public and the private selves are coalescing. So it's I and London, I and the all. So it's this moment where the collective and the individual traumas, as it were, continually enter into a dialectic, right? And there's these heaps of bodies which talks about, and the city as one heap. So death is a unique experience for the individual, yet also of the collective, right? And Defoe continuously plays upon this dialectic. This is where I come to the climax of the text, as it were, the description of that psychic pit. Now, you see, it's interesting in the way that HF is forbidden from going to this pit. People were forbidden from going to the pit. Obviously, you understand, for creating rumors and also for the spread of contagion. But HF goes there. And then once again, look at the way in which language fails. A terrible pit it was. And then he talks about, this is very interesting, in the way he talks about the 20 feet deep, 9 feet deep, 16 feet broad. So he's giving us an exact measurement of the pit. But when he talks about the experience of visiting the pit, there's a failure of language. And he says, this may serve a little to describe the dreadful condition of the dead, that it was indeed, you see, this is where I've taken my title from, very, very, very dreadful. You see, all those veries give us an idea of the extent of the trauma, but, once again, something where language fails, and the only thing that Defoe can utter is very, and such as no tongue can express. Now, this trauma of the plague is also somewhere associated with madness. And you see, madness being associated with cumulative social chaos. So mothers murdering their old children, shooting themselves, some dying of mere grief, others frightened into idiotism, foolish distractions, despair, and lunacy. So this is a moment when, collective conscious seems to go for a toss. And that is where, once again, as a society, you see, it's no longer the suffering, the physical suffering, but the fear of death and disease that is causing an acute mental, psychic, collective pit from where there is no escape. But is this just in the mind? You actually also have the trauma of the Buboes, as I talked about a little earlier. right? So the swellings grew hard, violent, drawing plaisters or poultices, and then so much pain that some died raving mad, some were not held to their beds, and some broke out into the streets, perhaps naked, and would run directly down to the river if they were not stopped by the watchmen or the other officers. So it's this acute physical trauma, acute mental trauma, acute collective trauma, and of course, Defoe says, and this is where Defoe is talking for the first time about the traumatized women and children, and the infants being found sucking the breasts of their mothers, and the mother dying as she's suckling the child. And this entire, image of Pieta, as it were, turned inside out. You see, this is Madonna with the child, and Madonna infecting the child. So motherhood and that moment of sustenance, the moment of greatest innocence, is reversed here in this grotesque parody where the mother infects the child or the child infects the mother. It's a hideous traumatic moment where the institutions of humanity, as it were, are collapsing one after the other. But then Defoe draws in something which I've talked about a little earlier, the secular moment within the trauma. Because even within these traumas, when Defoe is pondering upon them, and Defoe, remember, has a gap of almost 40 years here, right? Oh, no, not even 40. He's got a gap of almost 60 years, 50 years to be more precise. He's talking about that secular moment where, you see, it's no longer divine vengeance that he's talking about, but it is the conduct of human causes and effects, right? So this is interesting in the way in which the reflection on the trauma is actually leading a way out of the trauma into thinking about possible ways in which the trauma can be overcome. So as the trauma goes on, as the traumatic post-memory deepens, the way out of the trauma, as it were, is also generated. This is, of course, the euphoric survivor, one who survives the trauma and lives to tell his tale, as it were. Dreadful plague in London was in the year 65, which swept 100,000 souls away, yet I alive. Once again, you see, it's very interesting in the way in which understatement and the paucity of language seems to be the only way in which that trauma is, as it were, described. Now, let me come back to this question of post-memory, because I've sort of always felt that this is a text which engages with post-memory in a very interesting way. Let me just draw your attention to the theory brought out by Marianne Hirsch, who describes post-memory as the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before, right? So we remember only by means of stories, images, and behaviors among which we grew up. Now, for Bengalis like me, the partition is one such moment where the partition, the trauma of the partition, the memory of the partition is alive to us, for me personally, through the memoirs of my grandmother, for example, or my father, for example, handed over by me to my children, for example. And therefore, there's this repertoire of stories and memories which generations will share. The great example that Hirsch, of course, talks about is the Holocaust and the existence of the penetration of the Holocaust into the memory and the post-memory through narratives, right? And this is therefore the growing up with overwhelming inherited memories to be dominated by narratives that preceded one's birth or one's consciousness, to risk having one's life stories displaced and even evacuated by our ancestors. So I remember my childhood where I would sit, transfixed to the accounts of my grandparents moving from Dhaka to Kolkata and the way in which they had to settle down in Uttarpara, how every day was a new struggle. And somewhere, that has created a repertoire, a repository of memories which I live every day. So that trauma has been, as it were, handed down through memory into my own psyche, as it were. Now, in post-memory, of course, and this is where Caruth talks about history, and he says history like trauma, she says history like trauma is never one's own, that history is precisely the way we were implicated in each other's traumas, and that the infectious potential of trauma is paired with the timelessness of an extreme experience that refuses narrative assimilation into memory. It's this refusal, once again, that I am going to take a look at and ask you the question once again: why were there so few direct plague literatures? You see, you have copious references of the plague in Shakespeare, but you don't have a plague text. The only plague text that you actually have from the Renaissance and age of Shakespeare, as it were, is something which is by Decker. And you actually have in Johnson, who lost his youngest son to the eldest son to the plague, one poem. Whereas you have references to the pestilence, but is it, and how therefore does the plague come back into these post-memories through these visual arts? Hirsch is, of course, talking about these visual arts, these visuals, and I'm going to see Defoe's text is possibly the only great text of the plague post-memory along with Decker. Can we read, therefore, Defoe's text as the articulation of the deep social trauma, the continuing centuries of a deadly epidemic? Why? But the question is, why is Defoe writing about the 1665 plague in 1720 merely because the plague broke out in Marseille? Or is he creating a genealogy of that entire post-memory of the plague from the 1300s onwards? Because a person like Defoe or anybody in the 18th century would have been fed with narratives of the plague, would have just dreaded the plague being around the corner, and would have had lost somebody or the other in the family to the plague somewhere across generations. So the plague became that great post-memory which haunted Defoe, right? And therefore, it's this revisitation I'm saying is not merely a revisitation of the 1665 plague, although there are certain empirical details that Defoe provides, but he's actually revisiting every single plague that has taken place earlier. And it's very interesting if you look at the narrative geography, because those of you who did the course on London during the 18th century with me will remember how I talked about Christopher Wren after the Great Fire of London having recreated London. The city changed, completely changed. But Defoe is creating these imaginary geographies, is actually situating the plague pits where new houses would have come out, and therefore is creating an exact imaginative geography through which the post-memory can operate. And this is where I come to post-memory of the plague beyond the 18th century. And this is the great symbolist painter, Bocklin. This is 1898. In fact, Bocklin was inspired by or extremely afraid of a plague which broke out in Mumbai, actually. But when he was painting this plague, he's painting this in terms of the medieval monster. And you can see how the plague is enveloped in this figure with a great tail of death, creating this fire behind him with an axe with which he's going to decimate everything. And you have this pale green kind, this dark green kind of outfit. And there's the only color that you have here is that bright red female victim of the plague who lies in the shroud, as it were. So, you know, it's not that the plague was lost in memory, because the plague was breaking out in Europe also in the 19th century. So the post-memory generated images of the plague, which were haunting these artists. Now, this is another very important painting. We talk about the Spanish flu, but very few of you have actually taken any look at any substantial aesthetic representation of the Spanish flu. This is Munch, the famous expressionist painter who was debilitated with typhoid earlier, and he has a series of self-portraits with disease. This is a self-portrait with the flu. This is the Spanish flu of 1919. And you can see the distorted face, the gaunt frame. You can see his posture, as it were, submitting to the disease. So in a certain sense, what I'm arguing is that every epidemic that is being brought into aesthetics is also somewhere, sort of plumbing the depths of that post-memory of the plague. And this is going to be my last, as it were, sort of painting in terms, the last painting, because the next visual representation I'm going to present before you is not a painting, it's a picture. And it's a picture by Wojnarowicz of the falling buffaloes, which he took it from a diorama in 1988. Now, this is very interesting because Wojnarowicz was one of the very important artists who was influenced by Rimbaud, and he was himself gay, and this is the depiction of the gay epidemic and the era of Reagan and Margaret Thatcher once again, where you had the free market having a bull run, and where gay people were seen in terms of bringing great disease and infection upon society. And you could see these falling buffaloes as that moment when the epidemic is spilling out of control, as it were, and the moment when the buffaloes embody in their various falling sequences the image of an entire society collapsing. So you see how pandemics, epidemics, disease has bred a certain visual culture. But once again, it's not been as graphic as we would like to think about, because if you look at this history of this depiction, it's few and far between. So what is it within us that has forced us not to talk about this? Does it go back to Carriot's theory that the trauma is unrepresentable, and therefore we have had only very few representations of the trauma that the pandemic has created? Now, I'll just touch upon this conspiracy theory, because you see, pandemics, and this is my hypothesis, is pandemics have always bred theories and prejudices and led to a process of othering. That the Black Death was supposedly caused by the Jews. And this is the moment, ladies and gentlemen, when anti-Semitism actually took on a very strong hold on the European imagination, so much so that I'll say that the Holocaust was one of the fall-offs of one of the fallouts of the plague, as it were, where the Jews were seen as the other who were burnt in dozens, and therefore castigated as somebody who inflicted the plague upon Europe. So every plague in every society has generated this process of othering, the identification of an alien on whom therefore the rage and fury of the population can be unleashed. The Great Plague of Defoe was related to Dutch conspiracies, and therefore historically such an epidemic will push marginalized community to the fringes of education and further alienation. Some major work has been done on this, so I'm not going to just read out the slide. You can see how that Susan Sontag talks about deadly diseases spawning sinister connotations, and how, you see, this links up with my thesis about the trauma, that in a traumatized society, the trauma is not just merely fear, but it's also about the fear that lingers and the fear that causes further social alienation and division. The trauma that this particular epidemic has unleashed within us in creating divisions across society will not merely just subside when when our COVID situation goes away, but the fault lines in society that have been deepened, as it were, which were there, but which have been deepened and made extremely potent, will create traumas which will continue to haunt us for some time to come. This is one of the medieval depictions of the residents of a French town burning Jews, and this gruesome painting, as it were, hopefully is not a symbol of things to come post the COVID-19 situation. Right. I'll conclude here because I've taken, I think, quite a significant amount of time, almost an hour. But my point remains, once again, the paradox of narrative is where, the artist will try and depict the plague, depict the epidemic, but forever, and will therefore try to regulate it within the canvas or within the page, and where the trauma will be perpetually escaping him. Now, this is where him or her, and this is where I would like to bring in, and because I don't have time here, but other theorists who've talked about writing as being therapeutic in terms of trauma, as writing as being situated in context when we talk about trauma. But these are discussions that we can take up sometime later on, maybe, or if you want to follow it through in other discussions of texts. But what I'm trying to suggest is that there is, if I look at Foucault, there's a literature of the plague which collapses language. And there's an attempt at depiction or representation which seeks to regulate language. It's this continuous interaction between collapsing and control, between escape and regulation, that the narrative in Defoe functions. So here are my conclusions then. As a gateway, using Defoe as a gateway, we perceive how academics produced moments of secular modernity, how they can be read through theories of trauma, both private and public, how they can be read through the prism of post-memory, how the margins are perceived during times of epidemic. We're also looking at how narrative seeks to come to a kind of a crisis, that the epidemic produces a crisis in narrative where various genres are found to be inadequate. And therefore, we require the emergence, as it were, or the interplay of the genres through which alternative forms and voices can be traced. In case of Defoe, it's the history and the novel coming together, the various genres once again producing what will later on be called by the 18th century the theorists of the novel as factual fictions, that kernel of literature where fact and fiction moved seamlessly with one another. I think that is all that I had to say. Thank you for your very sustained and kind attention. And I would, of course, welcome your feedback, if any. If through the question answers, very good. If not, once again, you have my email there if you want to get in touch with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It was an absolute honor, as usual, to witness such an engrossing and captivating presentation. And on behalf of Team Northeast and the participants, thank you so much for giving such a relevant presentation in this relevant times. And I'm definitely sure that the main purpose of this Gnosis lecture series, that is to give new ideas and vistas to the academicians so that they can explore it by themselves and through the research scholars. Truly, you have done justice to our aim, as usual, sir. Thank you so much. Just to give you some data, we had around 260 participants. And this is for the first time it happened in the Gnosis lecture series that the number of participants increased after half an hour with every passing minute. So we started, when you started your lecture, we had a participant number of around 205 and slowly started increasing, which clearly testifies the kind of popularity in academia that you enjoy. And as I said in the beginning also, Amrit Sir is generally addressed as Amrit Da in academia. There are a lot of questions, and apart from that, there are plethora of congratulatory messages on behalf of you. I am taking them because they are congratulating me and Gnosis. And since you are an integral part of Gnosis,
exactly,
you are an integral part of Gnosis, so it's a great feeling. Now coming to the questions, I will take few. Before I take the question, sir, I will just inform you that what we are doing is, once the question answer session is over, we will be mailing you the questions. You take your time, write your answers whenever you feel, and then you revert back to us. And we will get it published in the forthcoming issues of Gnosis, which will be available online. So that this question answers also serve as a kind of archive for trauma studies and memory studies. Yes, sound is echoing. I think now it's all right, I guess. Yeah. The first question, sir, I have from Deeptanshu Das, a very erudite young scholar, budding scholar, come professor. We know each other for some time. He is presently working as assistant professor in Department of English, Dibrugarh University. And he has two questions which are very interesting. So I have given him the rights to directly ask you. Deeptanshu, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible. A very good evening. And
hello,
thank
Deeptanshu. Good evening.
you for this very enriching lecture. We have learned so much from your talk and this series of observations. So I have two quick responses, or rather questions. So can we also read the plague as a kind of spiritual crisis in the popular imagination, as much as it disrupted the social fabric? And my second question was regarding the kind of genre that Defoe was trying to create. So here we can see that the personal blends with the social and historical context. And also, as you rightly pointed out, he uses a range of imageries, such as monsters and all those grotesque, narratives. So was he also trying to create a new genre in the context of 18th century? And so I was just curious about that, and would love to hear from your side.
Thank you, Deeptanshu. There were two very, very perceptive questions which to answer properly would take me two other papers. So I'll frame very quick responses. You see, I see a certain transformation in terms of the spiritual crisis that you talk about. You see, when the plague broke out, in the Middle Ages, it was seen as the wrath of God.
Right.
It was divine retribution for the sins of man. And because there was no medicine there, the only way was to pray, right? Although there were certain, quacks who peddled their wares, but there was a perceptive realization that, only through spiritual submission could you actually get over the plague. It would run out its course, and then only would it subside and then come back, because the plague never went away, right? So that fueled this idea that it was, if you sinned, God would punish you with the plague. Right. Now, something strange happens when Defoe starts writing. You see, from the 18th century onwards, what I'm suggesting is, or the late 17th century, you see, there is an investigation into the nature of the plague, and they were gradually coming to realize that the plague was not merely being spread by God, but it was being spread by human to human contact. So in a certain way, what we are now looking at is a secularization of the plague narrative in Defoe, because Defoe, he talks about divine retribution, he talks about sinfulness. This is using the Puritan autobiography. Reflection is, after all, part of the Puritan autobiography. But he's also aware that the Puritan part does not preclude the secular part. He's slowly coming to the idea that the plague is something that human beings have in society, and there are human solutions to it, rather than praying for a divine relief. Now, interesting is, therefore, and since you asked this question with other novels, you see, take Robinson Crusoe as an example. Robinson Crusoe has the exact similar dose of Puritan autobiography. Yet, at the end of the day, as Marx pointed out, of these we take no notice. He's saying that Defoe is doing a very, very complex, and this is where you take your hat off to this man, a very complex balancing where slowly the spiritual crisis is making way for a more urgent medical crisis. Right. The second question is also very interesting. This is something which I've talked somewhere else, but I'll talk once again about this. Once again, when I point out that there is, and these are the major theorists who have talked about, you've of course read your Ian Watt, who talks about formal realism being the benchmark of the novel. But the operative theorist whom I want to use is Leonard Davis, who talks about fact and fiction as being extremely tenuous categories where fact sort of mingled into fiction and thereby upset what you will call the generic hierarchy. So there's no longer, this is the news, this is the novel. Take Moll Flanders, for example. How would you categorize it? Defoe talks about it as the true history. So yes, in a certain way, what you are absolutely right, and that is a very perceptive way of putting it, that Defoe is bringing in an entire subversive tone to what is a journal. First and foremost, this is a false journal, right? Yet, is it unhistorical? No. It was received as history till the 1750s, right? But once again, the first person narrative is being used, but it is also not a novel. So this dialectic between, and this is what Bakhtin talks about, you'll remember, this dialectic between history and the novel is something which Defoe is exploring in this particular text. Anyways, thank you. Two very, very interesting perspectives.
Thank you, sir, for the response.
Next, I have, thank you, Diptanshu, and thank you, sir, for the response. Next, I have a student of yours, sir, Shangomitra Mondol. I thought, why not she ask the question directly to her teacher? Shangomitra.
Yes, certainly.
Sir, my question is, and first of all, thank you for this informative session. And my question is, you said in your lecture that plague is more or less like a social collective trauma. Can we say that in our present time, COVID-19 is more like individual trauma, as we have to seek quarantine in our homes, how we are going through lockdowns one after another. So can we say that COVID-19 is more like individual trauma rather than collective trauma?
First and foremost, Shangomitra, it's very good to see you once again. The other thing is that, this concept of the quarantine was actually practiced from the earliest times. So quarantine is nothing new when it comes to COVID. You see, one of the ways in which the plague was controlled by the authorities from the Middle Ages onwards was quarantine. But you see, when you're talking about quarantine, it's really a personal trauma of yours only. Yes, you are quarantined, you are in isolation. But at the same time, the trauma that you are experiencing is not your own alone. I am experiencing it. All the 230 people who are listening in are also experiencing it at the same time. right? So you see, it's interesting in the way it is both personal as well as part of the community. You see, when you're looking at, just take a look at your news channels. I'm sure most of us are doing that. And you have a ticker, COVID-19, the number of deaths is 6,000 so much today. If you take a look at it. Now, you are afraid. Let me isolate myself so that I do not become one of the figures, right? But think about the trauma, think about the way in which all of us are linked by that same sense of fear, that same sense of, what you can call every single day waking up to the fact that we might not, be alive at the end of it. You see, at the end of the day, let me just share a small anecdote to you. Vishwabharati in all its, wisdom has suddenly declared that we are going to have sort of examinations from July onwards. And being the head of the department, you will not believe how many individual phone calls I have received from most of you. And yet, is it your own trauma alone? It's the trauma of all the people involved here. Your parents, my parents also, because they're worried about me going to invigilate in your exam. So it's this public and the private, which Defoe is also pointing out, where every single epidemic will breed it. Because the epidemic or the pandemic is, how is it defined? It's defined not in terms of one sickness, but a sickness that is spread over a large area across a large number of people. Right?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shangomitra. Please mute your mic, please. Now, sir, we have another scholar from Jadavpur University, and she is a regular participant in this Gnosis lecture series. I think she has not missed even a single one. Her name is Dipannita Borua.
Okay.
Dipannita has a question. I'll just ask her. Dipannita, I think I'm audible to you. Can you just switch on your video, please? Dipannita? Okay, I'll get back to her when her internet connection is okay. I'll just go to the next question, sir. Next question is by Dr. Ahuti Dhandukia. She's an assistant professor in Government Engineering College, Gujarat, Bhavnagar, Gujarat.
Sorry, Shoykot, I didn't get your question. Could you just repeat it?
Yeah, next question is from Dr. Ahuti Dhandukia, assistant professor from Government Engineering College, Bhavnagar, Gujarat. Her question is,
right,
how is the trauma of the present different from the plague trauma of the past? And what are the additional consequences that were not in the past epidemic?
Shukot, could you just come again?
Yeah, I'm having some internet issues, sir. Her question, basically there are two questions that she's asking. One is, what are the additional consequences? How is the trauma of the present different from the plague trauma of the past? And the second question is, what are the additional consequences that were not in the past epidemic? Present means she's talking about COVID.
Yeah, I think, that's a nice question, actually. The first one is something which I've been thinking about for some time. See, one of the very major differences is, you see, the concept of this vaccine. You see, for the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, into the 18th century, you actually did not have a closure of the plague. You did not have any sense that this plague could somewhere end, that the epidemic would end. But take a look at the epidemics we have had recently. You have had smallpox, you've had tuberculosis, you've had malaria, you've had AIDS, and of course the COVID-19. But then we somewhere have an idea that, we will overcome. I think that is a very important aspect which makes the experience of the trauma of the COVID. There's trauma, but also there's a certain degree of hope about the drugs that are going to come out and the containment procedures. You see, one of the most important things that we have missed here is of this disease called Ebola, which broke out in Africa. Now, Ebola, if you take a look at it, is far, far more potent than the COVID-19 virus. But we are tackling it. So therein lies the difference between the past and the present, between the plague, as it were, and the present situation. What are the consequences is something which is a question which Agamben has somewhat answered. See, Agamben makes an interesting point when he says that what happens during an epidemic is that, and this is something Foucault also talks about, that individual liberties get curtailed. So are we actually moving towards a society that is more authoritarian, where we will be mapped, we will be traced, we'll be identified, will be quarantined, our bodies will be held hostage by society, our rights will be somewhere curtailed? That is one possibility. The other possibility, of course, is, and that is where Agamben says, once again, I go back to Agamben, is we're thinking in terms of survival only, the rest doesn't matter. But equally, I will remind you that in Athens, when the plague broke out, the government actually started keeping food outside the city walls for the poor people who were outside the city. So there was also empathy, reaching out. So I think there is politically somewhere the epidemic will lead to a society which is more straitjacketed. Humanity will somewhere survive despite this. But that, the consequences is something which is a prediction rather than any coherent answer that I can give. Thank you.
Not only your college is asked or university is asked to conduct exams, even the schools are preparing to conduct exams.
Absolutely. And
we have the highest spike yesterday, around 9,500. And everything seems to be fine.
That ties up, with the idea that, the examination and therefore, results are somewhere more important than lives.
Than lives, yes. And it's uncomprehendable. And this is happening at a time where we are having the highest number of spike. I think yesterday it was around 9,500. Our testing capacity are almost worse. And I don't know where we are heading, but yes, what is ultimately important being in this academia, what I have understood also is ultimately it is important because, my house is adjacent to a school. That is a higher secondary school. So what is important now is studies and mark sheet rather than life and being careful, these things, it appears to be more, I don't know, the greatest gifts of postmodernism or capitalism, and we don't have control over ourselves. We are forced to do things, and I somehow feel that I'm enslaved over situations.
Yeah, and you see, Shrikant, when you point that out, and let me, since you made this point, and I have presumably a minute, think about what it is doing to the younger children. You see, we had the only spaces that were available for these younger children to build up a community was the school, right? Because we've sort of said goodbye to games. We have, social media and the internet and gadgets have made us even more isolated. So the school was the place where people would bond. Now, when you're moving towards digital education and other stuff, you are actually creating this alternative notion of selfhood, which is completely isolated. So what this is doing in terms of long-term social construction, imagining of the self is something which needs a considerable degree of introspection. Anyways.
And one more thing, sir, I found out during this lockdown that our government, be it state or central, I don't know, our government is basically run by, whiskeys and wines selling off. That tax and the tax that we pay, I think we don't contribute. I think that does not matter. I don't know. I am filing TDS for the last 8-9 years. I don't know. You might also be doing the same for a long time. It's very hodgepodge kind of. I am completely lost in this COVID-19 situation. Sir, I tell you, I have an elderly, I have my father who is around 70. He is suffering from neuro problems. I have a diabetic mother. And who will take guarantee? I don't, fine, we are young. If we get caught by COVID, I think we will sustain, we will survive. But what happens because of me, they get contracted? Who is taking that thing? Yeah, we are maintaining social distancing and all, but you see nowadays what's happening. The highest spike is 9,500 and everything seems to be fine. We are now in, I think, 8th rank in the world with more than 205,000 cases.
Right. I think Dipannita is here if she wants
to. Yes, Dipannita is here, and Dipannita's net is not very stable. So Dipannita will not be able to switch on her video. Dipannita, Amrit sir is there for you. Please ask your question.
Yeah. Hello, sir. Good morning. Good evening, sir. I'm so nervous. Sir, as we have gone through all these steps, but since it's not possible to go in detail each and every text, so we used to know about it, but we have never gone through it in detail. So thank you very much for it. And so my question is that while the Bengal Feminine of 1943 had greatly affected the women and the children with cases of child selling, prostitution and sexual exploitation, so does the plague also had similar kind of impact on women and children in Europe?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You see, that's an interesting question because that's been plaguing me for some time, really. That some of the most vulnerable segments of the population, and plague, you remember, is something which attacked the poorer sections a little more because they lived in dingy conditions where rats were the carriers. So yes, prostitutes, destitute women, the underclass of society, children were especially affected. And you see, the plague was enormously contagious. So a lot of them, they died. Yet, it's very interesting, Dipannita, that nobody seems to have written about these narratives. We don't have, I have at least not come across the narratives by women writers about the plague anywhere in the 18th century. Of course, you will have Mary Wortley Montagu, who went to Turkey and discovered, and rather brought back the system of inoculation from the smallpox, which led to the eradication of smallpox later on. But it's fascinating. Yes, they died in great numbers. Now, I am actually reading something which I want to bring before my very young friend Shubham Datta, who is organizing a seminar in the near future at Gokhale College. A text by Geraldine Brooks, where she talks about this village of Ayam, which actually self-quarantined itself. And this story of the plague is told by a woman, right? A maid, in fact. And when she tells the story, you actually see how, there were also women who were branded, especially in the villages, as witches. Interesting, because women who fell victim to the plague were branded as witches, and pardon my using the word sluts, who were pestilence was visiting them because of their immorality, as well as women who were surviving were often castigated as witches because they survived and because they were creating potions which warded off the plague. So women were impacted in very many ways. And that documentation, unfortunately, remains largely untraced, right? So if you happen to come across, and this is true about anybody who's listening into this discussion, if anybody comes across any other texts where I can find such references, I would be very grateful. Thank you for that question.
For your kind information, sir. Shubham Dotto is with us. He is listening to you very carefully.
He's a very dear friend and student, so I'm reserving one of my very best for him.
All the best. This was also... You have got the gold mine. Yeah. Next, I will ask sir a question. Next will be Shorbani Banerjee, ma'am.
Yeah, of course.
She will be asking you a question. Yeah, Shorbani, ma'am.
Hello, Amrit.
Hello, Shorbani.
Thank you for a scintillating session. I mean, not only me, my family were all listening in rapt attention. You were that engaging.
husband, Judge.
So now my question is, because since you brought up both the plague literature, the lack of literature during plague times, and you brought up the topic of partition, where again I think the Bengal chapter has got very little literature, so to speak. So do you think that this lack of literature is a kind of, conscious amnesia on the part of the literature, because it was a kind of a politics of avoidance to avoid the terrible pain and trauma?
Absolutely, Shorbani, I take your point with 100%, agreement. You see, isn't it very interesting that, the only real voice of the partition that we actually have in cinema, in the visual arts, is Ritik, after all.
Absolutely.
I see, and that trauma of, the border, and the border suddenly generating. You actually have a lot of literature from Punjab, as you point out, Manto, for example, being one of the major ones.
Yes,
but you see,
Manto,
Khushwant Singh. But once again, this literature, which should have been written about the life in the colonies, for example, the trauma of sudden, displacement, and then coming to terms with poverty, coming to terms with abjection, coming to terms with so many people being thrown into prostitution, so many people dying out of malnourishment, those narratives have, they have remained within us. You and I have those narratives within us, but somewhere, there has been very little depiction of these narratives, and I would say that the generation that underwent the trauma actually did not write about them. You see, because they were so raw, the wounds were so raw that they were recorded only through post memory in a certain way. Right. You're absolutely right.
Thank you. We can go on later over this for a longer time.
Right. It's so nice to see you again.
So same here. But it was wonderful. Let me tell you, I was enthralled. I think I took copious notes of what you were saying. It was that power packed. Let me say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shorbani.
It's wonderful to see the Bengal Academia in discussion in this platform. Thank you both of you.
Well, you should now give chance to somebody who's not from Bengal then.
No, I believe me, I am not at all partial. I'm trying to give chances as per the questions asked. So the next, please pardon me, the next is again from Bengal, budding scholar from Jadavpur University, Ananya Bhattacharya. Yes, Ananya, your question, please.
Hello, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. First of all, thank you so much, sir, for presenting such a beautiful lecture. It was extremely engaging, and I have taken so much of notes, and you just gave us an inroad into plague literature, and I was not aware of so much about it. So thank you so much, first of all, for giving us such an enriching lecture.
Thank you.
And so you were talking about the novel by Geraldine Brooks. I don't know whether I have not read the novel entirely, but I had just come across this novel. Are you talking about the same novel which goes by the name Year of Wonders?
Absolutely, yes.
Novel of the plague. Okay, and the protagonist of the novel is, I guess, she's Anna
Furst. Right.
Anna Furst. So okay, so I just when I heard about it, I just thought that whether it's the same novel that you are referring to. So I would definitely read it and have and just go back to what you are saying, what you have said in the entire lecture. So that's what it's not a question, but it was just an observation that I wanted to share.
Anuna, just let me add here that once you have finished reading the novel, just think about the end of the novel. This is my suggestion. I will not disclose the end because somewhere I'll be talking about this, but somewhere, the way in which the novel ends is related with the other novels of Brooks as well. So when you're looking at the novel, it's such a transcends plague literature into suddenly leaping into another realm of experience. But let me leave it to you to find that out. That's very interesting.
Okay, so thank you. I will get back to you on your mail ID with my observations.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. After a few days, I think after a few weeks, sir will be a little free from his administrative work, and then you can mail him after you finish your novel.
Yes, thank you,
can always mail me. It always comes before administration. Anyways.
But these administration works, I can completely understand. Yes. Next question is from Rizwan Mir. He's a research scholar from Aligarh Muslim University.
Right. Hello, Rizwan.
Rizwan's question, I will put it. I think there's some issue. So, how does Defoe's conclusion to his narrative address the issues of providence and God's offer of redemption for sinful humanity? This is question 1.
Okay.
Question 2 is, do you think that Defoe wants to offer a comforting ending or a disquieting one?
Well, the first question about the conclusion is interesting because there are two endings, as it were. The plague subsides to a certain extent during the autumn. So people come out once again in large numbers and start mingling, and there's another spike. So we are talking about second spurt, as it were. And then the plague dies out suddenly. And Defoe, of course, gives us a reason that, it is because of it was punished. God was trying to give the Britishers a chance, the Londoners a chance, but they went back to their sinful ways. So I would say, there's a disjunction between the divine narrative that Defoe creates and the ending of the novel. So that ultimately, although Defoe says that, it's God's intervention and the plague is dying out because God has, let it go away. However, there's no actual justification because men have remained as sinful as ever. I think Defoe was, playing around with the Puritan autobiography, and he was giving us this idea that the plague went away because, it went away because of herd immunity. So that is the question. So that is the answer to your first question. Secondly, the ending, as it were, is difficult to say, you see, because Defoe is writing this in 1722, remember. And there is a plague in Marseille, and there is the chance of an outbreak of plague in London. So I don't know, really. Defoe has created a narrative and he's given us a glimpse of what the plague might entail and how it might end. But whether or not it is a very comforting text is difficult to say. You see, all plague literature, all literature on the plague, or for that matter on any epidemic, survives on the generation and continuity of the factor of fear. If you take that away from the narrative, then the matter of consumption. You see, all these, remember, are no longer treatises. These are market fictions. So all these literatures will survive. These are popular literatures, by the way. They are not, erudite literatures. They are being circulated among the people at large. So there is always this feature, there's always this predominance of fear, I think. Similarly, what will happen in the present scenario? I am a great reader of thrillers. I read almost a thriller a day. And I'm telling you that already I'm looking at, on the internet, at least 12 thrillers which have come out. These are titled The Ghost of Wuhan, The Pandemic Outbreak, right? So once again, you see, these will generate fear. These will create doomsday scenarios. So none of these, despite probably positive endings, will be literatures which are very comforting. They'll always have this threat of a larger outbreak. And that is true, probably. We have tinkered with environment in such a way that we are always so little away from the next epidemic, as it were.
Thank you, sir. Yes, and with the advent of such kind of web series and all, people will definitely make a lot of thrillers based on pandemic.
Absolutely.
Next question is by Rishi Raj Pal. Rishi Raj, if you can introduce yourself to the, I don't have your background. What exactly are you doing? I know you are teaching a lot of theories, but please share your background to the audience, and then you please ask question to Amrit Sen.
Let me share his background. Rishi Raj is one of our very bright students. He's working on James Joyce for his PhD, and he has an extremely fine critical bent of mind. Rishi Raj, yes. Now that I've given you the introduction, you can go ahead.
What a lovely honor, Rishi Raj. This is the kind of person Amrit Sen is. What a lovely honor to have such kind of teachers. Yes, please, Rishi Raj.
Thanks so much, Amrit. It's really fascinating to hear you speak, always, as always, right? I know there are many listeners, so I won't take much time. My precise question is, what does Defoe do to the question of realism per se? And how is a literature who is tackling with something historical and historiographic act as both a treatise in some way and a kind of a linguistic venture, again at the lack of it, at the limit of it, and try to capture the fear as you said. So how the haunting, the spectral, as you mentioned, the idea of the crypt, be accommodated in a literature which was, again, a very popular, not really an erudite one. A literature looking not really the historical to inform, but to encash, if I may. Thank you.
Well, you were not very precise, so I forgot all about the first question, but let me talk about this element of the haunting, the spectral, and the way in which, you talked about realism once again, because that ties up with the question that you were asking. You see, what Defoe does is, because he has to also, I was talking about this concept of regulation and the fear of the narrative to actually spill over into the spectral. So Defoe has very, very stringent markers throughout his texts. If you remember, we probably did Maul Flanders together. You see the way in which Defoe actually locates street names. He's taking a turn into this street, then moving to that street, then moving to that street. The precise number, for example, if you read the Journal of the Plague Year, you actually have bills of mortality, the edicts of the government. So he's creating a whole superstructure of empiricism through which he can, in a certain way, be factual, bring the real, right? At the other hand, you see, there are intense moments, and this is where, HF becomes so very important. And that is the answer to your question, really. HF is the media through which, this balance is made, where there are sudden intense moments when the narrative seems to propel out. For example, when people are escaping, this intense existential question within HF, should I stay? Should I go? The visitation of the pit, for example. There's the episode where people are laughing at people who are throwing the dead bodies. And then HF says divine visitation might be on them, and they die after a few days. There's this question of the man who is being carried in the cart. He's sort of jumped into the cart even when he's alive. And he's suddenly rousing himself up when the people are about to bury him. So these are moments when the spectral sort of seems to run away with the narrative. And then there are these empirical markers. And in a certain way also, maybe tying up with the questions that were asked, certain providential Christian markers as well, where Defoe seems to justify this in terms of God's ways. So realism on the one hand and spirituality on the other hand counterbalance what you can call the scope of the spectral and the fearful, right? You see, that was a precise answer.
And the way this is going on, it can go on. But yes, we are sitting almost for 2 hours. The speaker needs break, and we also need break. So I will take last 2 questions, if you permit, sir.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Next question is from Ram Sebak Thakur. He is presently working as an assistant professor in Nepal, Tribhuvan University's one of the colleges.
Okay.
Yes, Dr. Ram.
Hello.
Yes,
hello,
you're audible.
How are you?
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. My question is, as you talked, pandemic really causes trauma, but what is the role of capitalism in making trauma more painful, or what you call the unequal distribution of wealth that leads to cause trauma more painful? And as we have this unequal amount of distribution of wealth, it really puts our old saying, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and Atithi Devo Bhava, in serious doubt. So what is your doubt, what is your take upon it?
Yeah, you see, once again, Dr. Ram, that's a question that demands, another paper really to answer. But I'll try and answer your question. It's a very relevant question. You see, any epidemic, in fact, is something which imbues capitalism with a certain degree of opportunity. And I make this point very carefully. See, because epidemics, most epidemics, including the plague, have a class character, right? They impact the poor much more than they impact the rich, right? Especially diseases like the plague or say cholera or typhoid, although the plague cut across populations, but that was not because, but because there were no cure actually. But this question haunted Defoe as well. You see, when would trade restart? So the dilemma that the government today is facing due to the pressure from capitalism is, do we put human life in front or do we put wealth and trade in front? One of the persistent anxieties of Defoe, and Defoe was a capitalist with a big C. He was, one of those people who were always trying out ventures. Now, in fact, he wrote The Great English Tradesman, a separate treatise altogether. Defoe's anxiety within the text is what happens to trade. So even whilst he's traveling across the length and breadth of London, counting the dead, he's also counting the losses. So in that sense, absolutely. in a larger part of the question, when you put this concept of the epidemic, you see what the capitalist enterprise also does is cuts across two ways. One is it creates ceaseless images of fear and death, and therefore regulates and thereby imposes its own ideology upon people. So the containment that is happening by the state is also, in a certain way, a capitalistic containment. What we do not realize is the way in which it operates. However, at the same time, a pandemic is a threat to capitalism, especially in the modern times, because you see, Defoe's time was the point when globalization was taking place for the first time. We are living in an age where that globalization has come almost full circle. So in a certain way, what Defoe saw as a threat to capitalism in terms of the epidemic, because you see, English ports could not allow ships from Marseille. Similarly, there are chapters in Defoe which talks about Spain and Portugal as banning, English ships. So Defoe sees the narrative as the epidemic as a moment when capitalism is threatened to a certain extent, yet realizes that within the state lies this regulatory apparatus to, as it were, create another system through which the capitalist enterprise will go ahead. Let me remind you of a text which I do not know whether you've read or not, is a popular text by Dan Brown. I don't remember the text, but he's talking about the plague. I think it will come back to me, but you see, there's this capitalist who has built a plague germ, and he's wanting to put this into the reservoir of water, so that 1/3 of the population will die and the resources will be made available to only the chosen few who have the antidote. You see, once again, when the vaccine does come out, you see what a great capitalist moment that is. You see, the one company which can then bring this out will, of course, reap the benefits. So the pandemic is both a threat as well as an opportunity, and the capitalist enterprise reacts to it in these plural ways. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, sir. And I have, although I have plethora of questions, but as I said, we need break. So please pardon us. And it's been...
the novel is Inferno. Himadri has just
Yes. There are many, even Devulino
Ma'am
has also said, yes. We need breaks. I will put these questions, I will mail these questions to sir, and sir will take time and will mail it back, and we will publish these questions in our forthcoming issues of Gnosis. The last but a lengthy question, sir. It's a 3-in-1 question, and it's a very interesting question. It's a combination of 3 questions, and that's why this will be a befitting ending to this such fruitful and engaging discussion. This question is from Shomobo Maiti from Delhi University.
Okay.
And Shomobo says that I have a few questions, although they are not directly connected with this presentation. His question number 1 is, was the connection of plague/disease and the colonial expansion? Question number 2, what was the condition of doctors back then? And question number 3 is, what was the role of climate environment behind this plague epidemic?
Well, you'll have to give me a clear margin of 10 minutes here. These are not 3 questions. These are 3 papers, as it were.
I hope you are comfortable, sir. 10 more minutes.
No problem, because this is presumably a very engaged researcher. First and foremost, let me talk about this question about doctors. You see, the Royal Society for Surgeons was called by the Lord Mayor of London to create a coherent policy for the plague. And they came up with a few suggestions, most of which was bunkum. So actually you had no clear response to the plague. Apart from, they suggested that it was caused by the miasma, which was fundamentally through smell. Therefore, there was this, people burnt incense in their houses, they carried incense, they carried dried flowers, so that the plague could be warded off by scent. It didn't. But gradually, towards the end of the 18th century, not towards the end, the middle of the 18th century, of course, there was this realization of contagion, that it was spread by human contact, and therefore people started isolating themselves. So we are looking at medical science as moving towards the diagnosis of the cause of the disease, one. Secondly, Defoe's text at least, and this is where, I read this very carefully because that issue of doctors fascinated me. Defoe is very critical about the doctors who actually escaped London, because he says that they are doctors and priests actually. He says that they are deserting their most important vocation and they should be treated as traitors really to the profession. He's extremely hostile towards them. He's extremely hostile also towards quack doctors who made a killing out of this. So there was this episode about a doctor who advertises that his advice is free. And when the poor woman comes, he says, yes, my advice is free, but my medicine has a cost. Right. And there are stories about doctors who are ripping off, people from their last potential resources. So doctors in Defoe's texts are, as it were, seen as very importantly rip-offs in certain ways. But there are people who tend to the flock. But the overwhelming thought in Defoe, at least, is that the doctor was not equipped. The doctor was failing to diagnose the plague, at least in 1722. It was only when the antibiotic came out that we actually had a cure for the plague. So that would take almost 200 more years. Not 200, but close to it. The second part of it is, of course, this question about climate. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned the other thing, that what was being done during Defoe's time was that they had identified that human contact could spread through coins. So coins were dipped in vinegar. There were jars of vinegar, and you actually dipped coins and picked coins from jars of vinegar. So quite obviously, some medical analysis or some medical arrivals were imminent, right? I showed you the cover page of Loimongiel, that treatise where you actually see two doctors pondering over how the plague patient is to be treated. This is one. So in terms of medical history, the plague was the greatest crisis to which spurred on the investment in science to a certain extent, the Royal Academy, the Royal Society for Surgeons, and this is the great age of science, as you are very well aware. The second question is this question about climate. You see, London at this point of time was one of the unhealthiest of cities, just like our cities are at this point of time. But London was especially unhealthy. And you will remember Charles Lamb's essays, where this dark pall of soot and mal air would linger over London. In the 18th century, it was even worse. There was no sewage. The houses were just adjacent to each other. There was no ventilation, and there was abrupt construction. See, all this generated a huge unhealthy situation where rats bred, and you are aware that the plague was carried forward by the fleas that fed on these rats. Additionally, what happened was that there was this idea that cats and dogs spread the plague. So people actually killed cats and dogs. So animals which could have fed on the rats were actually dead. So they multiplied. In fact, I was looking at some of the papers during the period, and there's this conversation between a rat and a flea, which says, and the rat says, "I'm so glad that the cats are all dead because now I can infect at my own sweet will." All this changed when? All this changed to a certain degree when the Great Fire broke out. You see, because once the fire broke out and London was reconstituted, you actually had houses of stone, built with stone. So the infection rate of the plague went down. You know, you didn't have such dank, dark houses. There were streets which are wider. Houses could not, had to be built in a certain pattern. So in a certain way, you can say that the fire did some good to London in that it made it a much more ordered city, and therefore made it slightly more conducive towards public health. There was a sewage system which was designed, but all this also would worsen towards the 19th century with rampant industrialization. London would become again one of the unhealthiest of cities. So that is it in terms of climate, and that is why people were escaping to the cities where the infection rate was much lower. Now, in terms of colonial expansion, you see, the plague, and this is a very, very important question, because how does the plague enter? It travels, and it travels through trade. It traveled similarly in terms of colonial expansion of England. Colonial expansion stopped for a certain period of time, but by 1720, England was largely rid of the plague and it took full steam. You see, the 18th century is the great age where the colonial enterprises took off big time. But with the colonial enterprise, you see, the plague died out in Europe, but entered India. It entered the other parts of Persia, for example, China, for example, although there's always a thesis that the plague actually came from these lands. But you have in the plague breaking out in Calcutta, you have the plague breaking out in Bombay, for example. And we were in the last week looking at the hut pens which were made in Bombay to quarantine people during the 1930s. So throughout the late 19th century, you see, and I'm sure you are working on that also, there was an outbreak of the disease as a colonial export to our shores. I am reminded, of course, of Stephen Greenblatt's essay, Invisible Bullets, where you see unsuspecting populations were exposed to pathogens which were alien to them, and then they fell victims to it. Right. So, yes, in terms of your question, colonial enterprise was thwarted for a certain bit of time, but it took off also immediately as the plague ran out of steam. And then the plague became the colonial export. And it somewhere became a threat also, because you see, malaria and plague were the two great, typhoid, were three great diseases which impeded, and which the English actually saw as impediments to their great colonial enterprise, right? I'm sorry, I rambled a bit, but then there were three very large questions, right?
Thank you so much, sir. In this hour of crisis and negativity, these lectures serve as a breath of fresh air every evening for me, and I'm sure for many participants. And the credit goes to the speakers who work so hard and they present such well-researched presentations. It's really, sir, very humbling for all of us. We are really honored to have speakers, scholars, researchers like you all, who every day is coming to this platform and delivering such kind of enriching, enlightening lectures. And definitely the objective of Gnosis is achieved through speakers like you also. It has been a very long and engaging session, sir. And we still have more than 100 people with us. There is a part of Bengal today who is which is experiencing Kal Boishakhi. So there's a lot of internet issues in some parts of Bengal as well as in western part of India and central part of India. But in spite of that, we had more than 250 plus people. This speaks of your aura and your research that you have been doing for since the time of your school days. And you're talking about school and college days. Shubhajit Sengupta sir is with us also for a long time. He has been very patiently listening, and your discourse, your talk, your engaging lecture, and the question answer round. He's still there with us. I tried him to bring on this platform. I don't know. I think he might be having some internet issues. So thank you, Shubhajit sir. Ajita ma'am is with us. Thank you, Ajita Bhattacharya ma'am, and all my senior teachers and colleagues. And thank you, Amrit sir. It was tremendous. It was, words are not enough to describe, but yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Shubhajit sir is.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Shubhajit sir.
I'm Shubhajit. Thank you.
You need no introduction.
Thank you, Amrit, for this very fascinating lecture.
Well, Shubhajit has another role. He was my opening partner during our college cricket days. So
yes.
We'll never forget.
But we are past our prime now.
I have seen that photograph of his hitting that ball through the mid-on. That photograph I've seen. It's a fascinating photograph, provided the kind of camera and devices we had that time. And I think many of you all might not know, Shubhajit sir is a tremendous photographer, and he draws a lot of things. I have been following him for a long time, and ardent follower of Shakespeare and teaches Shakespeare like as if he's a very engaging speaker. We will have him sometime if he has if he agrees to give his valuable time sometime in the future. Thank you, Amrit sir. And
all right, I will. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoykot, for providing this platform, and thank you all of you who have listened so patiently. Thank you very much for your questions. I am really humbled by the love that has been showered on me today, and the engagement with which all the scholars have reacted to this discussion.
Thank you so much, sir. It was absolute honor and pleasure from the entire team of Gnosis to have you today. Thank you so much, sir. This is Dr. Shoykot Banerjee signing off. Tomorrow we have Dr. Bashudhara Rai, a poetess, a tremendous speaker and a researcher. Dr. Bashudhara Roy from Jamshedpur. Thank you, Professor Amrit sir. Thank you so much, all of the participants. Thank you for joining. See you tomorrow at 5:20. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Good night.
Good night. Good night.